I don't think I've ever felt more out of place than I did that night, sitting in the Crystal Ridge Hotel ballroom, surrounded by over 200 people dressed in designer suits and glittering gowns, all toasting to my wife's triumph. Madison looked stunning, elegant in that midnight blue dress she picked out weeks ago, her hair swept up like she was royalty. And in that moment, she was senior vice president at Blackstone Capital. Everyone cheered her name like it was the sound of success itself. I clapped too, smiling for the cameras, smiling for her, because I thought that's what a supportive husband does. I had no idea I was about to be publicly gutted like a fish. The ballroom shimmered with white chandeliers and silver-draped tables. Waiters floated by with champagne on silver trays. The kind of place where people use your first name like a status symbol, like being on a first-name basis meant you mattered. Madison was glowing, not just with pride, but with something harder to place. Something sharp. She climbed the stage with practiced grace, took the mic like she was born for it. She thanked her team, thanked her father, Gregory Langston, the real puppet master of her career, and then, with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, she looked right at me. "There's one more person I should thank," she said, pausing for dramatic effect. "My husband, Daniel. You all know him, right? He dropped out of Stanford to build a little tech thing in our garage." There was polite laughter. I forced a tight smile. She continued, and her voice dipped lower, amused. "Let's be honest. It's failing. It's been failing. But don't worry, my father and I are buying it out tomorrow, finally putting it out of its misery." Some people chuckled. Others glanced around awkwardly, trying to decide if this was a joke, or if they just witnessed something they shouldn't have. Her father, standing nearby with a glass of whiskey in his hand, raised it in a toast like she'd just landed on the moon. My ears rang with the sound of forced laughter. My hand sat frozen on the tablecloth, knuckles white. She kept talking, the words a blur, but I didn't hear them. I just stared at the base of my wine glass, watching the red swirl like blood. No one looked at me directly. No one asked if I was okay. I don't even think Madison looked again in my direction. I stood up slowly, barely aware of it, walked past the tables, past the clinking glasses and perfume and polished shoes, past the doormen with their polite nods, and the valet who tried to take my ticket. I didn't speak. I didn't grab my coat. I just kept walking into the cold night, leaving behind the woman who used me for years and then gutted me in front of the only crowd that mattered to her. And not a single soul followed. I met Madison 8 years ago at some rooftop networking mixer in Palo Alto, where half the room wore Patagonia vests over Oxford shirts, and the other half were pitching apps no one would remember in 6 months. I was somewhere in between, 25, exhausted, caffeinated beyond reason, and too deep into launching my first real startup to be thinking about love. But then she walked in. She had this presence, like the room shifted slightly to make space for her. Madison Bentley, Wharton MBA, daughter of Warren Bentley, the kind of venture capitalist whose name opened doors before you even knocked. She wasn't local. She was in town visiting friends, scouting the valley. As she put it with a smirk, we collided by the bar. Literally. She bumped into me reaching for a drink, and before I could apologize, she smiled and said, "Is this where all the Stanford dropouts come to network?" I laughed, not realizing until later she wasn't joking. She was dressed like someone who had never stood in a security line. Tailored dress, expensive watch, heels that probably cost more than my monthly rent at the time. I was wearing a startup t-shirt under a wrinkled flannel. Still, something sparked. She liked the way I talked about Optimus Ops, my cloud automation platform that was barely more than a functional beta. I liked the way she challenged everything I said, not out of malice, but precision. She didn't flirt. She dissected, and it made me want to impress her in a way I hadn't felt in years. We started dating fast, intensely. She flew back and forth from Philly that last year of her MBA, crashing in my shared apartment in Mountain View, where she'd wrinkle her nose at the secondhand couch but still fall asleep on it with her head on my lap while I debugged code. I wasn't blind. There was always a gap between us, not just in money, but in how we saw the world. I believed you could build something revolutionary with passion, some brilliance, and the right people. She believed in strategy, in leverage, in knowing the right people before building anything at all. Where I saw a risk as necessary, she saw it as a currency to be traded carefully. Still, I thought we were equals. I thought love was the great leveler. Within a year, I proposed with a modest ring I'd saved for over 4 months to afford. She said yes like it was an acquisition deal, eager, decisive, and already talking about logistics before I'd put the ring on her hand. Her family paid for everything. A Newport Beach wedding straight out of a magazine. White tents by the ocean, string quartets, custom calligraphy menus, the works. I remember standing at the altar watching Madison walk toward me, radiant, while somewhere in the back of my mind, A voice whispered that I didn't belong here. That maybe none of this was mine. During the reception, her father gave a toast, one I've never forgotten. He raised his glass and said, "Sometimes the best companies start with broken rules and broken degrees." Laughter followed. The crowd thought it was clever. I smiled through it, even though it was aimed right at me. I dropped out of Stanford to chase something I believed in, but to him, I was a cautionary tale dressed up in a tux. Still, I told myself it didn't matter. That love would outweigh the imbalance. That even if her family never respected where I came from, Madison did. At least I thought she did. Back then, I hadn't yet learned that love without respect is just a leash dressed up as a ribbon. The first cracks in our marriage didn't come in the form of screaming matches or slammed doors. They came quietly, with sarcasm slipped between sips of wine, with the way her tone changed when she asked about my day. At first, I didn't even notice it. Madison had always been intense, driven, focused, obsessed with the next title, the next deal, the next win, but I used to find that magnetic. I thought we were just wired differently. She was scaling the skyscrapers of high finance while I was down in the trenches, building something with my hands. I told myself we complemented each other, that our paths were just taking different shapes. But over time, her admiration twisted into something else. I'd be in the garage, pulling 16-hour days refining code, chasing bug reports, pitching to mid-tier clients, and she'd step in after a 12-hour day in glass conference rooms, dressed in tailored suits that cost more than my entire workstation setup, and she'd smirk like she'd walked in on a hobbyist tinkering with bottle rockets. "How's your dozen clients in Ohio?" she said one night, dropping her purse on the counter while I microwaved leftovers. I laughed it off then, not because it was funny, but because I didn't want to pick a fight. But she kept saying it. That same line. "Dozen clients in Ohio." Like it was some kind of punchline I didn't get. Her career at Blackstone exploded. She made VP in 3 years. She was closing 7-figure deals while I celebrated every new small business that signed on with Optimus Ops. To me, each client meant something. Another person who believed in what I was building. To her, it was noise. "You should think about getting a real job," she said one morning over coffee, staring at her phone. I looked up from my laptop, startled. "I have a real job," I said. She didn't even look at me when she replied. "Daniel, come on. You're almost 30 and still working out of a garage. That's cute when you're 22. Not now. Cute." That word stuck in my head like a sliver under skin. Her father, Warren, never missed a chance to dig deeper. Every holiday turned into a passive-aggressive performance review. "Still coding in the garage?" he'd ask, handing me a drink I didn't want. "You know, if you go back to school, I can make a few calls." Always framed like generosity, but it was condescension, pure and simple. I stopped going to their family events when I could. When I couldn't, I learned to smile and sip and count the hours until we could leave. The worst part wasn't the mockery, though. It was the shift. Madison stopped seeing me as her partner and started treating me like a long-term bet that hadn't paid off. She offered feedback on my pitches like I was one of her junior analysts. She'd suggest rebranding, recommend changing my tone during meetings, and when I told her I was close to finalizing a beta with a logistics firm that could scale us significantly, she blinked once and said, "Cool, let me know when it's profitable." I began to shrink around her. I don't know when I started editing myself, leaving out details, downplaying good news before she could do it for me. The garage stopped feeling like a place of creation and more like a bunker. We still slept in the same bed, ate at the same table, but the distance between us felt like miles. I was no longer a husband in her eyes, just a project she'd grown impatient with. Something broken she once believed in, but now felt embarrassed to have backed. At some point, I stopped telling Madison anything about the company. It wasn't even a conscious decision at first, just a reaction, a survival instinct. I'd walk through the door after a day of breakthroughs and setbacks, and she'd barely look up from her phone. If I did start a share, she'd cut me off with a sigh or some half-sarcastic comment like, "Still trying to turn dust into gold?" The last time I actually tried to update her, I told her we were testing a new algorithm, one we believe could drastically reshape supply chain optimization for mid-sized vendors. She looked at me, blank at first, then leaned back in her chair and said flatly, "Daniel, nobody wants your company. It's worthless." That one landed like a gut punch. I didn't defend myself. I just nodded and said nothing. That was the night I shut the door for good. She had no idea what we were building, no clue that while she was closing leverage buyouts in high-rise boardrooms, I was deep in something far more transformative. Marcus and I had been working obsessively, refining a proprietary algorithm that took bloated, inefficient logistics data and made it clean, actionable, lean. It wasn't sexy like app design or crypto, but it was powerful. We'd quietly onboard a pilot program with a regional distributor in the Midwest, and their monthly savings blew away expectations. Word spread. Referrals came in from unexpected corners. Then Novatech Systems reached out. The first email came through our generic contact form, and I thought it was spam. It wasn't. Their senior director of infrastructure had been referred to us by someone we didn't even know personally, a guy from a minor logistics partner who had seen our pilot results. Novatech didn't just want to test us. They wanted in. For 6 months, Marcus and I played the game tight. NDA after NDA, virtual meetings disguised in our calendars, documents stored in encrypted drives. We didn't bring on lawyers until the last 2 months of negotiation. We barely told our early investors, just enough to keep them calm. We knew how fast these things could evaporate. Every night I came home, I kept the weight of it all buried behind the same quiet smile. Madison would complain about the noise from the garage if I worked late. Sometimes she'd pass me in the hallway and ask with mock concern if I'd made any friends in Ohio lately. I'd smile and say nothing, letting her believe what she wanted to believe. The gap between what she thought she knew and what was actually happening grew wider by the day. While she was out celebrating another round of bonuses, I was on late-night calls with Novatech's M&A team, hammering out details of what would become a multi-million-dollar acquisition. It wasn't just money on the line. It was everything I'd sacrificed for, everything I'd bled into this company. Madison had no idea that her favorite punching bag had just turned the corner towards something irreversible. She didn't see the way Marcus looked at me during our final draft of the agreement, like we were standing on the edge of something enormous. And still, she mocked me. At dinner with friends, she called me her passion project. She joked that I was married to a spreadsheet in a garage, always with that condescending smile like the punchline wasn't even worth explaining. I never corrected her. I didn't need to, because every time she dismissed me, every time she let her father suggest I apply for MBA programs to get on a real track, I just nodded and poured myself another drink. I had the numbers in my head. I had the signed term sheet in a locked drawer. I had the deal she couldn't even imagine forming in the shadows of her arrogance. And I was about to let her walk face first into the single biggest miscalculation of her life. The morning light came in soft through the high windows of the garage, cutting across the workbench where I'd spilled coffee the night before in a haze of adrenaline and anticipation. The whiteboard was still filled with half-erased figures, projections, a crude sketch of the final integration plan Marcus and I had refined for weeks. I stood with my back to the door, pretending to review code, even though I hadn't touched a line all morning. I knew they were coming. Madison had left me out of the loop for years, but her father wasn't subtle. When men like Warren Bentley planned a corporate ambush, they liked to do it with a flourish. The black SUV rolled up at exactly 8 a.m. I watched them approach through the window reflection, Warren leading the way, purposeful and smug. Madison half a step behind in another tailor coat I'd probably paid for once upon a time. She didn't look at the building like it was a business. She looked at it like it was a storage unit that needed to be cleared out. They entered without knocking. Warren walked in like he owned the place, as if the floor itself should straighten beneath his shoes. "Daniel," he said, not with warmth but with finality, like he was addressing someone in denial of an inevitable truth. Madison didn't speak. She stood beside him, arms folded, her expression cold, rehearsed, just like the night before when she'd humiliated me in front of 200 people. Warren got straight to it. "We've looked at your numbers, or what little we could find, and frankly, I'm surprised this thing is still breathing." He laid a folder on the table, like it was a mercy. $300,000. For the whole thing. That's generous, Daniel. That's more than this place is worth. He smiled like someone offering a lifeline to a man too foolish to swim. "You can walk away clean. No more garage fantasies. No more Ohio clients. You'll finally be free of this burden." I didn't say a word. I didn't flinch. I just turned my laptop toward them, angled so they could both see the screen as a waiting room loaded. "Actually," I said quietly, "your timing's perfect." Their eyes narrowed in confusion, just as the Novatech logo appeared and the call connected. On the screen, 5 people appeared: legal, finance, M&A, and our main liaison at Novatech, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Eileen Cho. She greeted me with a smile. "Daniel, ready when you are." I looked at Madison and Warren as their postures shifted, stiffened, the blood already draining from her face before a single number had been spoken. I clicked once, and the DocuSign loaded. Eileen continued, her voice crisp and undeniable. "We're finalizing the purchase of a 65% stake in Optimus Ops, valued at $82 million. The final amount being transferred today is $52.3 million, with Daniel Walker retaining 35% ownership and full creative control under the new structure." Warren's mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. Madison didn't blink. Her arms had dropped, fingers twitching at her side like she wasn't sure if she should run or scream. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I simply signed. A soft chime confirmed it. The documents were live. The call ended. I stood slowly and faced them. "You came here to rescue me," I said calmly, my voice even. "But you didn't even realize the building was already on fire, and I was the one holding the match." Madison stared at the screen, then at me, as if seeing me for the first time not as a failure, but as something she had dismissed one too many times. Her lips parted, maybe to object, maybe to beg, but nothing came out. Warren reached for the folder he'd placed on the desk, like he could pretend this visit never happened. But I didn't let him. "You can keep that," I said. "Might make a nice keepsake for the day you realize you try to buy an empire for the price of a car." And then I turned away, because they weren't worth another second of my silence. We met in the same conference room where she used to take calls for Blackstone deals, the one with the glass walls and the view of the hills, though neither of us were looking out at anything now. I had a manila envelope in front of me, and she had that look she wore when she was trying to act like she still had leverage. But her posture was different now, rigid, defensive, not composed. Her hands fidgeted near her lap, fingers clasped too tightly, like she hadn't slept. I slid the envelope across the table, not slowly, not theatrically, just directly, with finality. "You tried to buy me out like a liability," I said, my voice steady, almost quiet, but every syllable sharp. "You don't get to be here for the win." She didn't open the envelope right away. She didn't have to. She knew what was inside. The divorce papers had been coming since the moment she and her father walked into my garage, pretending to do me a favor, all of it. Her speech at the party, the humiliation, the offer to strip my company for parts like I was some broken asset. They left no room for repair. We had a prenup. Ironclad. Drafted by her own legal team back when she thought I'd always be the underdog. Back then, it was her way of protecting herself from my failure. She was so certain I'd be the one clinging to her success that she built walls to keep me out of it. She never imagined it would be the reverse. The prenup made it clear. No joint ownership of intellectual property. No claim to future earnings from assets developed independently. No spousal support. In short, if we split, she walked with whatever she had in her own name. She thought that would always be the better half. She contested it, of course. Claimed emotional investment. Implied hidden accounts. Said she had helped me strategically, even if she hadn't touched a line of code or sat in a single pitch meeting. Her lawyers tried to dress it up with phrases like contribution through emotional labor and long-term partnership value. But none of it mattered. Not when the judge saw the video. It had gone viral within days of the acquisition. A clip from her promotion party, recorded by someone near the bar. Her laughing, smug, delivering the line about my failing tech thing, right before announcing she and her father would be putting it out of its misery. The camera caught the faces in the crowd, awkward, cringing, and then panned to me, seated at the back, stunned, humiliated, saying nothing, just absorbing the blow. That video became the one thing her lawyers couldn't scrub away. The judge's ruling was swift. The prenup stood. The court recognized the video as proof of public disparagement, willful cruelty, and an intentional act to undermine my business reputation. Her claim to assets was denied. Her appeal was denied even faster. From there, things unraveled for her with a kind of poetic speed. Blackstone had no appetite for scandal, especially not the kind that made headlines across startup and finance news cycles. She was quietly put on leave, then permanently removed from her role. The official line was restructuring, but everyone knew. Her name disappeared from the executive board within 2 weeks. Warren's firm didn't fare much better. Were the stunt he pulled, trying to buy a rising tech firm through backdoor pressure and underhanded tactics, leaked fast in the venture capital circuit. A few big investors pulled out quietly, then a few more made public statements about reevaluating partnerships. He tried to spin it as a misunderstanding, a misjudged opportunity, but no one wanted to align with a man who tried to lowball a company that sold for 8 figures the next day. Reputation is currency, and has plummeted. And me? I didn't celebrate. I didn't gloat. I just moved forward. My phone stopped ringing with pity and started ringing with respect. People who'd once overlooked me were suddenly interested in my ideas, my voice, my leadership. I wasn't just the guy in the garage anymore. I was Daniel Walker, founder, architect, survivor of a quiet war that ended exactly as it should have. Free, respected, and finally whole. 6 months after the deal closed, everything felt both surreal and sharply, unmistakably real. Optimus Ops wasn't just surviving anymore. It was thriving and fast. Over 200 companies had integrated our system into their operations, and more requests were coming in weekly. The scalability was finally proving itself. not just in theory or whiteboard mock-ups, but in real logistics chains, in warehouses, in manufacturing floors that used to lose hours a week to inefficiencies they couldn't even track before for the first time in years. I didn't feel like I was chasing the dream, I was living inside it. Marcus and I were suddenly being asked to speak on panels we used to watch from the audience. I sat in rooms where people leaned forward when I opened my mouth. No one asked where my degree was from. They asked about architecture, about deployment strategies, about the next stage. I'd walk into events and hear a name whispered between conversations. People shook my hand with the kind of grip that held real weight, not empty flattery. Recognition had a new shape now. It didn't come dressed in applause. It came in quiet nods of respect, in invitations to spaces I once had to beg my way into. It was at one of those events, a tech founders networking gala in San Francisco, that I met Rachel Jensen. The ballroom was modern, glass-walled, filled with polished shoes and expensive watches, but she stood out without trying to. She was in a dark green blazer, minimal makeup, hair tied back in a way that said she had better things to do than worry about aesthetics. She was talking to someone about machine learning bottlenecks in early-stage startups when I walked past, and something in her cadence made me pause. We ended up at the same table during a break between panels, both nursing drinks we weren't really drinking. She recognized my name before I said it, but she didn't lead with flattery. She asked smart, blunt questions about Optimus Ops, about its limits, not just its wins. I told her the truth. She listened like someone used to building, not just observing. Eventually, she smiled and said, "I'm Rachel. I used to be at Google. Left a few years ago. Now I throw money at people who still believe in messy innovation." I asked if she cared about founders without MBAs. She laughed, leaned back in her chair, and said, "I don't care about degrees. I care about vision. Credentials never build anything worth a damn." That line stayed with me longer than I expected. We kept talking that night. Then again the next week, over coffee. Then over dinner. There was no game, no performance, no carefully curated persona. With her, I didn't feel like I had to prove anything or brace myself for comparison. She never once mentioned Madison. She never asked about what had happened. She only asked where I wanted to go next. Rachel became a presence in my life, so different from what I'd known before. Steady, quiet. She didn't need to be impressed. She didn't treat my ambition like a threat or a puzzle to rearrange. She saw what I was building and respected it. And more than that, she saw me, not as a fixer-upper, not as a man in need of direction, but as someone already whole, already enough. For the first time in years, I believe that too. 3 years later, I stood on a stage in front of hundreds at a leadership summit, a mic clipped to my collar, lights angled down on me, and a screen behind me displaying the name I used to scribble on the margins of legal pads, Optimus Ops. The company I built in a garage, the one mocked at a ballroom full of people who thought they understood value, now sat at a valuation north of $250 million. The number was staggering, but it wasn't what I wanted to talk about. I didn't come there to flex metrics or bask in applause. I came to tell the truth. The room was full of founders, investors, corporate leaders, the usual crowd. Most wore that same polished ambition like armor. But I wasn't there to impress them. I was there for the kid who once sat where I had, building late into the night, knowing exactly what he was building, and still wondering if it would ever matter. So I started at the beginning. I told them about the night I sat in a crystal ballroom and listened to my wife humiliate me in front of 200 people, laughing about the little tech thing in our garage, announcing to the crowd that she and her father would be buying it out just to kill it of. I told them about the silence I carried out the door that night, about the weight of being dismissed, not just by a spouse, but by an entire room that nodded along like I was already irrelevant. Then I walked them backward through the years. How I met her, how I was the one without the pedigree, the one everyone assumed would eventually fall in line or fall apart. I told them about the marriage that eroded not from conflict, but from condescension, about the way success was weaponized against me, used as a mirror to reflect back everything I wasn't supposed to be. And I told them the part that mattered most, the part no one saw coming. How the company she mocked had been in final negotiations for a multi-million-dollar deal when she tried to buy me out for scraps. How she walked into my garage with a check and a smirk, and how she left watching me sign a contract for over $50 million in equity. How everything they believed about my failure unraveled the moment the truth walked in. There was no anger in my voice when I said it. No pride, either. Just clarity. Credentials don't define value, I said, pausing long enough for the words to land. Vision does. Titles didn't build this company. Belief did. And not belief from institutions, or investors, or families with the right last names. Belief from the inside. From the quiet part of you that knows what you are, even when the world rolls its eyes. The room was silent, still, listening in that way people do when they aren't waiting to speak next. After the talk, I couldn't open my inbox fast enough. Emails flooded in. People I'd never met. Young founders, burned-out builders, engineers from forgotten cities, thanked me. Not for the numbers, not for the company, but for saying out loud what they'd been holding inside. That you could be overlooked, doubted, discarded, and still win. I ended the talk with one line. I didn't plan to say it, but it came from somewhere real, somewhere scarred but clean. I looked out at the room, calm, certain, and said, "She underestimated a dropout." I became everything she said I never could, and more. The applause didn't matter. What mattered was that it was true.